well, they call them interdimensional beings. I think that they can actually operate through the time spaces that we currently have. And that's based on stuff that we've seen. That's based on information that we've been told. And then also, too, I think that there's this historical aspect of, this gets into the deeper theories and concepts of religion and I think the history that we currently know.
You've probably heard that recently Florida Representative Paulina Luna was on the Joe Rogan Experience. She explained that there are what she called interdimensional beings that operate within our time and space that have technology that we're just beginning to barely understand. We're going to examine some of her claims, what she said, and then go over how this is possible. Because in a plasma and fractal universe, all these things are possibly true. And we could even have technology that utilizes it. So with that said, let's dive in. In this first clip, she's talking about how she served with someone who saw an anomalous object flying over a base that they were serving at. He was reluctant to talk about it because he was afraid he was going to lose his security clearance.
He didn't want to, from what I gather, get taken off flight status. And he's like, I really can't discuss it. We couldn't really identify it essentially, and it had outperformed them. And so that was my first, from a military perspective, kind of experience with someone who basically, there's a stigma within the flight community. Do you want to lose your security clearance? Is there this level of crazy that people kind of brand that will stick with you and kind of ruin your career?
Do you think that it's possible that these are U.S. vehicles that are top secret?
I definitely think that there's a level of advanced technology that the U.S. government has. And I think that tech can be housed within the defense contractor realm. And of course, some information is going to be classified. But I can also tell you, and this might sound crazy, but based on our investigations and stuff that we've seen, okay, there is definitely something that I think would rival what we know currently with physics, and a tech that potentially is out there that we don't have the ability to reproduce, because it would basically be like dropping a cell phone right off back during the time of maybe caveman. So we just don't have the tech to develop it yet.
This is a line I've seen in a lot of different places. I've seen UFO researchers like Linda Moulton Howe say this exact line. It's like giving a cell phone to a bunch of cows and asking them what to do with it. This is a great way to make us seem incompetent in the face of trying to understand technology that we've actually been trying to understand for over 80 years now. Plasma research has been going on for over a century, and they discovered its unique abilities to negate electric charge exchange by maintaining what we call a double layer. And if we understand that gravity is actually an electromagnetic force, mainly, in which charge is exchanged between different parts until reaching equilibrium, much like how a circuit functions in electronics, we begin to understand that if you were able to isolate something from the electric circuit that is the Earth, you could essentially hover in place or move at speeds that seem ridiculous. And you wouldn't be affected by G-forces. You wouldn't be affected by all the negative impacts of moving so fast without a self-containment layer, a double layer. Because you would, from your perspective, be stationary. Before we get too much further into this, I want to invite you to head over to my website, adamweichel.com, and sign up for my newsletter, where you can learn more about the plasma universe and your place in it, along with signing up for my free Fractal Consciousness Guide so you can begin to align yourself in a fractal universe.
What I can also tell you is, based on our interviews, and this has been something that you can go back and watch with the congressional hearings, but I was actually able to ask some of the witnesses, what are these things? And they keep saying interdimensional. And then when you talk about the interdimensional aspect of, are these things pre-existing, maybe outside of what we currently know as our own dimension? That stuff can kind of all sound crazy, but at the end of the day, my job as an investigator is to receive all the information, decipher it, and then ultimately, from a congressional aspect, if you do have contractors that are withholding information or operating outside of the purview of the federal government.
So when you say that it operates outside our understanding of physics, what specifically are you saying? What happened?
To I guess break it down in simple terms is that I think that some of the tech that exists that whatever these things have, these energy things have.
Energy things? What do you mean?
Well, they call them interdimensional beings. I think that they can actually operate through the time spaces that we currently have. And that's not something that I came up with on my own. That's based on stuff that we've seen. That's based on information that we've been told. And then also, too, I think that there's this historical aspect of, this gets into the deeper theories and concepts of religion and I think the history that we currently know. And
let's take what she said here one step at a time. She's talking about interdimensional beings that operate within our time and space. And to me, this is talking about beings that are able to encase themselves within an electromagnetic plasmic bubble that has a double layer that allows itself to basically isolate itself within our environment. And then if you were to take the same double layer and then somehow compress it uniformly so that no information is lost or destroyed down to the smallest scales of our reality that we call Planck scale, you'd be able to ride within these subatomic regions of our reality at extremely fast speeds. It would look like something disappeared and then reappeared in a different location. But what's really happening is that it's going into the sublayer of our reality and then reappearing or uncompressing where it would like to, move to. You could actually use this same principle to teleport to different dimensions or different octaves of our reality that are actually stacked directly on top of our reality. In this way, you begin to understand and expand on the concept of a fractal holographic universe, where every single place in the universe contains the whole of the entire universe. And I believe this actually begins to explain the different entities that have been interacted with throughout human history in religions, and different encounters, and different mystical experiences that many yogis, gurus, and just straight up spiritual people have experienced in their lifetimes.
And that kind of spins off into another topic of, you have the modern day Bible, you have this aspect of Bibles or books of the Bible that have been removed that explain and kind of touch on these topics. And I think that we're in a time and age where you have such a vast amount of information that we have access to via social media, via your cell phone, via the internet. And so it's really changing the way that we understand, the origins of life and the spiritual reality that we know.
Again, you've probably seen a lot of different testimonies about like the different glyphs on rocks and how there's a general idea that there was some sort of other beings that the ancient humans used to interact with, or saw like great scenes of lightning in the sky. These are all plasma beings. These are all plasmic structures that exist within our universe that are both self-organizing, intelligent, and can exist for extremely long periods of time.
When you
Currently.
say interdimensional beings, that they know that these are interdimensional beings, how do they know that?
Based on testimony would be based on witnesses that have come forward. But what I can tell
So
you
the
is
witnesses just were told that they were
that
interdimensional?
they've seen things. And what I can tell you without getting into classified conversations is that there have been incidences that I believe where very credible people have reported that there have been movement outside of time and space.
To demonstrate this, I'm going to use what's called a toroflux, or a toy that demonstrates how different spheres can interact with each other and then create a 3D structure from its flatness. As you can see, there's a center here in which everything is contained within it. If you compress this into a sphere, you see that it's got very similar properties like that of a planet or ball lightning. However, if you then uniformly compress it so that it becomes flat again, you have the same structure, but that has been uniformly compressed into a very, very thin region or size. Imagine that you are a ball of energy that has a double layer, and you want it to be uniformly compressed down to the Planck scale. What you would do is you would, here's the double layer. This outside sphere is the double layers of this plasmic structure. And then by compressing uniformly and then shrinking down to whatever scale you want, you're able to ride in the Planck scale or the subatomic regions of space and time. And then when you wanted to, let's say view a certain area or teleport yourself, all you have to do is come back out, existing in our 3D atomic world. This simple concept is actually how pretty much the entire universe works, because it's when these different subatomic layers coalesce and then create vortices that give rise to topological structures or 3D structures that we get physical matter in our realm. So this undulation then eventually becomes a new atomic structure, moving within the greater atomic structure or world, like the Earth or the solar system, and then interact with us in ways that our five senses understand.
Have I seen a portal open? No. Have I seen a spaceship? Personally, no. Have I seen evidence of this? Yes. Have I seen photo documentation of aircraft that I believe were not made by mankind? Yes. Is there historical significance to this? Yes. Is there multiple events that go back to, I would argue, maybe even before the time of Christ that have documented this in text? Yes. So do I believe that the government has access to certain technology? Yes, to an extent. And I believe that certain contractors potentially have back engineered this tech. I think that that's what can explain the advancements that we're seeing. But I also believe that this is a dangerous level of hidden information from the American people.
It seems crazy that people have access to information that shows that there's something outside of us that is more intelligent, at least more capable than we are, and they hide it from everybody else.
What I can tell you is that when you have thousands upon thousands of people around the planet throughout time that have reported something,
right,
to say that those people are crazy, to say that, the whole concept of even just asking the question that you might not necessarily be psychologically sound, that in itself, that's a disinformation campaign.
Yeah, these disinformation campaigns have been going on for centuries and millennia. Even back when Christ was crucified, they were trying to control the narrative so that the people would worship Rome as opposed to some sort of deity, or worse, themselves. Because if people wanted to actually move into an era of self-respect and self-understanding, they'd have to really understand that the divinity is within us and always has been. Because just like how these UFOs and different craft have a double layer that surround them and allow them to encase themselves within a reality, we're doing the same thing with our aura, the different layers of our skin, and even the individual cells in our body all have a double layer or an outside layer that encapsulate it from the outside environment. And when you take into account that people have been able to detect our electromagnetic field that's produced by our heart as far as 60 feet away, it becomes obvious that we are also microcosms of the macrocosm, or a fractal of the greater holographic reality. And ultimately, I think this is what they're trying to hide. And there's some evidence that groups like Freemasons and other esoteric elite groups have understood this for a very long time.
What's also interesting, though, is when we're talking about tech, right? The ability for this tech, being that it exists, to change dependence for entire governments on things like fossil fuel, etc.
I think this is actually the main reason a lot of this has been hidden. When you start to investigate these different UFOs and how we could replicate this with our technology, you quickly get into understanding plasma and consciousness, and then understanding that also at the base level, as we talked about before, at Planck's scale, there's so much potential energy just roiling right below the subatomic scale that if you could figure out a way to probe that energy, you could get something to arise out of seemingly nowhere. And this self-sustaining structure, if you were able to maintain it, would allow you to constantly generate energy that pulsates from the Planck scale. And this is actually what they were afraid Nikola Tesla was going to deliver with his Wardenclyffe towers. Free wireless electricity generated by something like the Earth, which itself is maintaining its electrical structure and is able to provide endless amounts of electric power, which is actually quite possibly what the pyramids in Egypt were doing, at least the Great Pyramid.
What would be the rationale for keeping a photograph of a known absolute not of this world craft?
I think that part of the fear is that you have advisors that think that, the American people or humanity might not be able to handle it. There's this protective complex, but then also too, I think when you are talking about these things, for a lot of people, I think that it kind of can rock your world a little bit in regards to where you stand in a faith perspective, and then also too, an aspect of, well, how do you even begin to explain it?
Yeah, this is actually one of the biggest issues because, as I talked about in a previous video, Eric Weinstein was talking about how he heard that from one of the people in the CIA during the Biden administration. They talked about how they were going to obfuscate entire branches of physics to stall progress and then keep it just for the military-industrial complex. Reading between the lines, he's talking about plasma physics research. Again, something that we discovered back in the late 1800s and then really understood post the atomic bomb. And people like Tesla were working on this and really beginning to understand and explain these things by calling them things like Tesla waves and scalar waves, which are all to say it's all the longitudinal aspect of the electromagnetic spectrum that is the underlying substrate of all electromagnetic energy in this universe. And when you understand this, and you understand that you can actually embed things into this longitudinal aspect and then also cause things to rise up out of it, it's a game changer. And it also begins to explain things like the ether or the Akashic field or where we go after we die. Because this longitudinal aspect can infinitely stack and squeeze into smaller and smaller spaces, stacking all the way down to the Planck scale or into subatomic realities.
And all I'm going to say is, look, and we can go into some of the books that were removed from what we know as the modern day Bible, but I read through the book of Enoch multiple times. And I'm not saying that these things are angels. Okay, that's not at all what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that depending on where you are in regards to your whole perspective on whether or not God exists, like I believe in God, I'm a Christian. There has to have been, and there's admissions that there was other creations that God made, but that we were the most prized creation. And so I think that this can open up a bigger topic of discussion. What I will say is that what's been interesting is, and I've had a mass array of people that have come in, right? Like we have people that come in that claim that you can use this ability to basically dog whistle these things in from a psychic ability.
Yeah, I've heard people say that.
And I think that there's something there. Otherwise, they wouldn't necessarily be able to provide some of the video evidence that they have. But then that also brings up the question of if these things are interdimensional, which we've had witnesses testify to members of Congress, and that was all publicly out there. That would then bring up the whole, well, if this is really transcending dimension, the power of what you say, thought, all of that. And then, you can look into our own government's declassified documents that the CIA had on different experiments. I mean, if you go to cia.gov/reading room and you can see all the declassified documents. And so I believe it was called Stargate, and it was talking about, the basically psychological experiments where they were trying to basically remote view and all that. Why would our own government be looking into that if there wasn't something there?
Again, this comes back to a fundamental understanding that those in power may have been understanding for a very long time now. That our ideas, thoughts, words, and just general emotional state generate our reality, especially from an individual perspective. Because if we keep in mind, again, that we have our skull and our brain encased in different layers, going skin, muscle, bone, and then finally reaching the fluid that surrounds the brain, that our brain is encased in a series of double layers that isolate it from the outside environment. And what that means is that our interpretation of reality isn't really what's happening. It's what our senses of this physical body are able to translate into electrical signals that then get interpreted by our brain. And then the energy or the plasma that surround and exist in between the different neurons and dendrites in our brain allow us to create what's commonly called qualia, or a quantitative experience of consciousness. And once we begin to understand this en masse as people, this is when the world changes. This is when we start to recognize the God within and the God without, and the God that exists in all things, including each other. Ultimately, I think this is what Jesus was said to be trying to teach. The kingdom of heaven is within.
From what I gather, and by the way, I'm not a theologian in any capacity, but just from my personal opinion on this. So you have the Ethiopian Orthodox text, which has, I think, 88 books of the Bible in total. But in the Ethiopian Orthodox text, it's basically kind of like a mainline OG version of the Bible. And then sometime in the 4th century, there was actually a group that came together and they removed certain books. And the story goes that Revelations actually had replaced Enoch. And so it's interesting because when you're looking kind of full circle on, you hear the stuff that some of these people are talking about, and then you see and you read the book of Enoch, which is a wild read, okay? And then you look at kind of what our modern day description is of what angels and entities are versus what Enoch was seeing and reporting in his language and ability at that time. I think that there's a lot that brings you to then ask the question, well, why would they remove this information? If it's truly, written in part of the oldest Bible in the world, why would they then take it out?
Again, the answer is they wanted to have a top-down control system in which we could be controlled from the top of whatever structure is ruling the government. They didn't want us to recognize the divinity within. So they took the book of Enoch out. This book of Enoch also explains the seasons, how lightning works, different types of structures that are intelligent. It's as if he was taken either astrally or physically through the different layers of our reality and how they all work together.
I think there's something going on. I think there's more going on with people than we let on. There's some extra thing that's happening with human beings, the way we're all connected to each other that we don't really totally understand. And I think the idea that you can access information that's not local, I don't think that's that weird. I think that might be an emerging aspect of human consciousness or an aspect of human consciousness that's atrophied.
Or just an aspect of spirituality that we've previously forgotten because we're in such a digital age that kind of programs you into the rat race. And I think people, the more that they're kind of like, there has to be more to life than just like a 9 to 5. There's also this aspect of, being a human and like, if you have kids, I think that's like one of the things like you have a daughter, I have a son. And it's like when you're a parent, it kind of like makes you realize like, wow, there's this aspect of like love that I didn't know existed before. And you can kind of really be there and help, grow this next human and influence that person. And it just kind of, the human experience is something that, you can make it as special as you want. And this aspect of, us being able to have those little quantum breadcrumbs is what I like to call them. Like, have you ever been like talking about something and like you'll go somewhere, hear something and there's like confirmation of what you've been talking about, or, something happens and you're like, asking a question, then all of a sudden it pops up, kind of there's the answer. And I think that those little things just mean you're on the right path and doing what you're supposed to do in this bigger picture.
Yeah, well, that's a good way to live life. If you believe that, it's healthy, it's smart.
I think this is actually a fantastic place to leave this, as we literally attract reality in ways that are in resonance with us. And again, if we're talking about a holographic fractal universe where all points contain the whole of the universe, let's say you're here and you're thinking about getting some sort of food or understanding like the nature of the universe. I know from personal experience, once you start scratching at that, things will just fall into your path. Things like YouTube videos will pop up in your feed that your conscious mind is like, oh, what's that? And you'll feel so drawn to it that it's hard to ignore. When your conscious mind notices these things, it's as if the subconscious mind, which again exists in a state of pure potential right on the Planck scale and knows everything that's happening in our reality and is filtering out everything that we don't need to know consciously. If we keep that in mind and understand that when our conscious mind becomes aware of something in weird ways, it's in resonance with something we've been investigating before or are attracting through the law of attraction. This is literally how the universe works, and it's the only way it can work if it's holographic and fractal. Because if everything is contained in a single point, the only way you're going to be able to interact with anything else is if you are in phase or in frequency alignment with that thing. So quantum breadcrumbs is a beautiful way to explain this. They are potentials that are arising to meet you where you are. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe, as any new gain of momentum really helps this channel. Also, I have a Patreon. Feel free to check it out and sign up. All support really helps maintain this project that I'm trying to build, which is bringing us into an era of modern mysticism. Not through mystical understandings of things that aren't really real, but an actual concrete understanding of the world as plasma and an interactive conscious membrane that we exist within and interact with constantly. I also have some pretty cool services like plasma astrology and spiritual coaching that I'm offering. So if you're interested, please go over and check it out at my website. Thanks again.